like we were talking about. And I'm really going to focus on the mechanics and just kind of stick to plain language and avoid kind of like theoretical concerns. If you have questions about that, we can answer them. But the prior lectures probably do a pretty good job of that. So we just want to make sure you know how to use the code with what I have prepared. So I'm going to be walking through examples of how to estimate a normal distribution, a Bernoulli, and also an exponential distribution. And it'll be a lot, and I'll cover the MATLAB and the Python scripts, but we're always going to be following the same analysis steps that I have listed here. So first, we're going to get data. You know, in this case, we'll be simulating data, but in your case, you'd be loading data from an experiment. Then we're going to set a prior on theta. So just choose a set of initial values. In this case, we're just going to stick with the Jeffreys prior because it doesn't bias the data as much. Then we're going to cycle over the data, updating that theta based on the data itself. And then once we're finished, we can start working with the posterior to get statistics from it. And then finally, we'll generate a summary figure, which we encourage you to do, not only because it's good to visualize your data, but also because if you're new to the code, it's good to make sure you haven't made any errors. They'll be fairly obvious if you've done something wrong. All right. And so, yeah, here is the GitHub. We have MATLAB and Python code, and this is the link. And in terms of Python, the dependencies that you'll need are Python 3, Matplotlib, NumPy, SciPy, and also something I'm calling Gallistel, which is where all the custom scripts are right now. But once you have that, we can start, and I'll go over the example for the normal distribution first, because this is a distribution that comes up a lot in the data that we work with. So say you had something like a switch task, and you have a distribution of switch times using the tasks that Randy and Fua have developed. And those tend to be normally distributed or normal-ish. Or it can be any set of data. So we just get any set of data and we plot it, and it looks something like this. So a nice normal looking distribution with a mean of 2 and a standard deviation or sigma of 0.2. And we want to apply the analysis to estimate or get best estimates for the mean and the standard deviation. Covering the Python scripts first, this is what things would look like. And this is a script called example normal that is in the GitHub. And we're going to walk through each of these steps for the normal case. So first, like I'm saying, we need to get data. In this case, we're going to simulate it. So we set a mu of 2, a sigma of 0.2, and we draw 50 samples from a normal distribution following those parameters. Then we're going to set our prior. And at this point, you'll be calling from the Gallistel script. So there's a class in there called normal that has all the methods and the properties that you'll need to run the analysis. So you set that as a variable in your script. So just normal conjugate is what I chose. And a convenient thing about that is that for each class, each distribution, the class itself stores the Jeffreys prior as a property. So if you want to set theta according to the Jeffreys prior, you'd use this line of code. So just normal conjugate.Jeffreys prior, rather than having to go look it up on Stack Overflow or Wikipedia. But anyway, once you have that, we're going to iterate over the data just with a for loop and update that initial value for theta accordingly. So the normal conjugate class or the normal class has a method called update theta that just takes the current data value as well as your current theta, and it returns a new one. And you just kind of cycle over your full data set. And once you're finished, you have hopefully a well-defined posterior distribution with parameters according to that theta. And we can get statistics from it using the posterior stats function inside of the normal class. So here for the normal case, you do need to input a few things. You need to give it a range of possible mu's for your data, so possible means, and also possible taus. That's the inverse of the variance. And the values you choose won't really be that consequential, so long as you give it a sufficient and wide range for each parameter. The worst thing you can do is set them too narrow to where you're not capturing the area of maximum density on the posterior. And that'll make more sense once we generate the summary figure. But anyway, we use this method, input those two variables along with our final theta, And we can get our best estimate of mu, tau, as well as the posterior PDF, which you can visualize with this summary figure generated by the lines here. So this is what it should look like. On the right is the posterior distribution. So we're using a normal gamma distribution, which has two axes. On one is the range of those possible mu's that we set. And on the other are the possible taus. And each point is the posterior density for different combinations of those two parameters. So we have these wide areas of low density, and then one area of concentrated density, which is where we're going to get our maximum likelihood estimate for the mean and for our tau. And if we get that, we get those two values and use them to draw a normal distribution. So that's going to look like this blue line here. So this is our estimated distribution in blue, with that mu and tau corresponding to this maximum likelihood estimate. And if you're simulating data to get used to the code, I also have a method that allows you to plot your simulated distribution, which you specify explicitly, so your true distribution as a dotted line. So you can kind of visually compare how things are working. And anyway, yeah, we can also print out, our best parameters as well using these lines. And so long as that makes sense, and feel free to ask questions at any point, but we can move to the MATLAB routine, which will generally follow directly from what we did in Python. So we're generating data using the normRand function in MATLAB. We're setting our data manually here according to the Jeffreys prior. We iterate over the data. And the important thing is we're going to use this normal gamma underscore update function to update theta. So it's still taking, like in Python, the current data value as well as your current theta, giving you a new one. And then below that, we're going to be getting statistics from the posterior. So we're setting our plausible mu's, our plausible taus, and we're going to get our posterior PDF, that heat map that we saw in Python, using this normal gamma function. So that just takes the mu's, taus, theta, and this logical tells it to generate a figure. But once we have that, you can pick through these lines to figure out how we get the maximum likelihood estimate. But when I was making these examples, I didn't realize that we didn't have this as just an automated output for many of our functions for the normal distribution. So I think after this meeting, we're probably going to work on adding that as an output to the normal gamma function. But if you're interested in how that works, you can use these lines to get it. And yeah, so that's it. And the summary figure for this function, the MATLAB scripts, looks like this. It's all kind of summarizing the posterior in different ways at different angles. So we have a 3D graph that's essentially the heat map we just saw. So on one axis are possible mu's, another axis are possible taus, and we have this peak of density on the z-axis where our maximum likelihood estimates come from. On down below gives kind of a top-down view of the graph, just a contour plot with different density regions around our estimate. And these are the marginal distributions. So essentially we've rotated this graph for mu and looked at the distribution selectively along this wall, our mu axis. This is what we would see. And likewise, if we rotated the graph, looked at the distribution along this wall, this is what we'd see for tau. And yeah, so that is it for the normal distribution. I'm going to go over the Bernoulli distribution next. And for the Python scripts, I'll really start sounding like a broken record because I set up, so if you look at the Gallistel script, each distribution has its own class. And I've set it up to where all of the methods are very consistent across them. So we talked about the normal class. It has an update theta function and a get posterior stats function, but so does the Bernoulli. It has its own, and so does the exponential. So this helps keep your code clean and kind of consistent across different analyses. All right. So for the Bernoulli case, this is what things would look like. We're going to generate data from a Bernoulli distribution, and we're going to set our P, the probability of success, to 0.2. And now we're going to set our prior. So this is where we call the Bernoulli class from the Gallistel script. And that's our Bernoulli conjugate object. We're going to set our theta using the Jeffreys prior within the class. So for reference, that's what that looks like. We'll iterate over the data. The update theta method here still takes the data value and the current data, just like the normal distribution class did. And once we get our final theta, we'll start getting statistics, again, using the get posterior stats function, which in this case only takes your final theta. There's no user inputs here. But that'll give you your best estimate of P, your posterior, which is a beta distribution in this case, as well as the X values corresponding to the posterior. Okay, and finally, we can use these lines to generate a summary figure. And on the right here is still our posterior distribution. So on the x-axis are values from 0 to 1, so possible values for P. And our theta gives us parameters for the beta distribution. And when we use that, use those parameters, we get this red line. So kind of a normalish looking distribution with some skew, with an area of high density around our chosen parameter, so 0.2 here. And the green line marks the mean of this distribution, and that's our best estimate of P, the probability of success. And on the left, we translate that more into real world terms. So the green bar here is just corresponding to this green line, or a number around 0.2. And the probability of failure, this green bar, is 1 minus that value. And again, if you're simulating data, I've added a method that'll let you add these bars, the true distribution, to this graph. Okay, yeah, and if we print out, the best P, it comes out very close. All right, and in MATLAB, we're going to do the same thing. Normal 50 samples from a Bernoulli distribution with a P of 0.2. Set our theta manually, cycle over the data, and the key function here is the base S Bernoulli P, again, which takes the current data value, the current data, to return a new one. And then after that, we use that same function to generate a summary figure with these two additional input arguments, and also get our P estimate. And that's why we're going 1 to the length data minus 1, because when I'm running this, I only like to generate the summary figure once. So, if you save that last data point for your final call, you can generate an overall summary figure with this, which looks like this. So it's just the posterior distribution. So 0 to 1, we have high density around our chosen P. All right. And finally, for the exponential distribution, this is the Python routine. There's one key thing to note. So when we're generating our data, we're going to set a mean of 0.2, and we're going to get our data points from an exponential distribution with that parameter. And the important thing to note about this case is that you want to pass in your data as cumulative. So as a real world application, if you have a task, an operand task where an animal is pressing a lever every once in a while, and you want to estimate the mean response interval, you pass in those response times relative to the start of the session. So they accumulate, not the inter-response interval values themselves. But so long as that's clear, the rest of the analysis is straightforward. So we make a conjugate object, so the exponential class from the Gallistel script. We set our theta as the Jeffreys prior. We cycle over the data using the update theta method, but in this case, it takes the current data value and the current theta, but it also needs the current n. So your sampled number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, through the data array. So we update our theta. We get stats from the posterior using the get posterior stats function. In this case, the user specified parameter is the number of bins to use when you're drawing the posterior, so the intervals between X values. And this, Randy talks about this a bit in the manuscript, but it won't be that consequential to the results of your analysis so long as it's over 100 or something like that. It's just it'll differ things by a few fractions of a decimal point. And yeah, finally, we're going to generate a summary figure that summarizes everything, which will look like this in Python. So on the right, again, is the posterior. So in this case, it's a gamma distribution with these two parameters coming from our theta. So it looks very normal in this case. And the green line is the mean of this distribution. So it's mean inter-event interval. It's around 0.2, like we said. And that corresponds to the green line, which is just an exponential PDF, across the true X values. And yeah, the dotted line, indicates the true source distribution. All right. Oh yeah, one thing to clarify, when you're working with the exponential, you can work with the mean, of the PDF itself, or the inverse, so lambda in this case, so that's 1 over the mean. Basically what that indicates is if we looked at this process that we're trying to estimate for a period of 1 second, how many events should we expect to occur within that window? And the reasons to use one or the other just depend on your needs, but they indicate the same thing. All right, and then finally, we're going to do the same stuff in MATLAB. So get a bunch of exponential samples from an exponential distribution with a mu of 2, take the cumulative sum of the data, set our Jeffreys prior, cycle over the data using here the expo update function. So that takes the n, the current data value, as well as theta. And then finally, we use that same function to generate a summary figure when we're running our last data point. And that will look like this. So in this case, it plots both the posterior as a function of possible means of the distribution, as well as the inverse of those values, so our lambdas, and they look fairly similar. But yeah, that's all I have prepared. If anybody wants to ask questions, and sorry if I ran over time slightly.
No, that's great, Ben.
Okay, thanks.
Let's see if there are questions. Okay, I guess there are no questions.
That's fine, yeah.
I hope I can do the share screen. I've never. Oh, wait a second.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you please set Randy as co-host?
I'm sorry for what?
I'm asking Ajit to set you as co-host so that you can.
Okay, good.
Yes, I did it now.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, I see that, but at this point, I know I'm still on Zoom because we're talking, but now I've lost even the thumbnails, and I don't know how to get it back. I know there must be a way. I'm wondering if maybe I shouldn't quit and then come back in. I think maybe that's the.
You can try that, sure.
Because otherwise you're going to have to talk me through what the hell to do. Obviously, it's a problem at my end, and it's something I've never. This has happened to me before with the Zoom. So let me quit and come back in. Okay, if I even can find out how to quit. Well, I can quit. So let me see here. Okay, where am I? I'm in Safari. Okay, I think if I quit Safari, I'll be I'll leave Zoom. Quit Safari.
Is it possible that you are in the second desktop?
I'm okay. I quit Safari and oh, wait a second, Zoom. Oh, hang on.
Okay.
Oh, hang on. Oh, there we go. Okay. I found a way to get we old folks, we're hopeless. Okay, now we can do share screen. Yeah. Okay, so actually it's this screen I want to share. Okay, so now if I do. Okay, is that everybody see the title, the opening slide? Yeah, good. Okay, so we come now to Shannon's coding theorem, which is a wonderful thing. It's extremely intuitive, but it has all kinds of consequences, as you will see in the subsequent lectures. Shannon's starting point starts from the following sort of completely obvious point, particularly if you're a communications engineer, right? So you're trying to send messages, like say with Morse code, right? This Shannon's starting point was obvious even to Morse. It's obvious to anybody who thinks about the problem. Obviously, you're going to send, let's focus on Morse code. You're going to send some letters much more often than others. And which ones that are depends upon the language that you're transmitting in. In English, for example, Z is pretty uncommon, whereas in German it's common. In both languages, E is the, well, in English, it's the most commonly transmitted letter. So if you're making a code and you're going to use dots and dashes, some combination of dots and dashes for each possible letter in the alphabet, you're going to, if you've got any brains, you're going to give E the shortest possible code. And indeed, the code for E is 1 dot. Okay, it doesn't come shorter than that. So that's the starting point. And what Shannon's coding theorem proved is that, first of all, if you think about it, it's not obvious whether there is a limit on optimizing code. And he proved that, yes, there is a limit. And that limit is reached when the code word for the different possible messages are proportional in their length to the log, to the surprisal, which, now recall that the surprisal is the log of 1 over the probability. So the greater the surprisal, the less often you will be transmitting that particular message in a set of messages, right? And the same applies to when you're storing them. This is particularly important when we come to the neuroscience side of things, because all we people who study timing know that the animals are storing the intervals that they encounter. And a memory is properly thought of as a communication medium. It's the medium by which the past communicates with the future. And it's a central element in any computing machine, because the memory is what transmits results from an operation performed in the past to operations performed in the indefinite future. So the thinking of a communications engineer applies to memory every bit as much as it applies to the actual transmission of data. Okay, so that's the coding theorem, that the optimum code is when the word lengths are proportional to the surprisal. And so that means the data that occur frequently, the things that have to often be stored in memory or often transmitted, get whatever your physical medium, whatever your physical realization of the code is, you use less of it for the high frequency items and more of it for the low frequency items. So I've listed here on this slide, I've been trying to get neuroscientists to think seriously about what the code might actually be, which is really surprisingly difficult. But just to make sure you're on the same page when you hear, what could we mean neurobiologically speaking by a code word? Well, it could be a spike sequence, right? We sometimes think, well, if it's this many spikes, it means one thing, and if it's a different number of spikes, it means another thing. In a computer, we mean a bit pattern, right? Sequence of 1s and 0s. There are labs all over the world looking at to use bacterial DNA as the memory in conventional computers. If you're using that means you're using nucleotide sequences to store information. So in this case, the code word is the number of nucleotides that stands for a given interval, for example. Now, most neuroscientists think that it's synapses are what encode memories. You cannot get them to think about how the synapses encode memories, but there different obvious possibilities. One is that you could use some number of synapses to, if a spike came in on synapses 1, 5, and 6, it would stand for one thing. Or if you set the weights to synapses 1, 5, and 6 on some neuron, that encoded one thing. And if you set a different set of synapses, that would code for something else. Or it could be the activity patterns of neurons, which is what people seem to be referring to when they refer to a population code. Whatever you imagine the physical realization of must be, this applies. You can't escape Shannon's coding theorem. Okay, so let's, this has one very non-obvious consequence, which really startled me when it was first pointed out to me. Because at first one thinks, well, maybe there isn't even a representation of the distribution in the brain or in whatever device one is interested in. But a corollary of Shannon's coding theorem is, no, that can't be. That is, if the system somehow remembers the different things in the support vector, right? Remember, we're always talking about a support vector that maps to a probability vector. If we believe, as presumably we do, that the brain has some way of encoding the different things, right? Changes this synapse or changes that synapse, then those things that encode then are the words, and the length of those things, whatever it is, must in some sense have a length, an amount of physical resource that is used, and that constitutes an implicit probability. So the only question is not whether there is a representation of the probabilities. There must be, if they are stored or transmitted, if these things are stored or transmitted, there is always an implicit representation of the probabilities. The only question is whether the representation is efficient or not. And what Shannon's coding theorem tells us is that it's efficient just in case the physical resources employed reflect the true probabilities of what's being coded out there in the world, the source statistics. This insight is the basis of a huge research program in computational vision, right? Whole labs devoted to determining what are the source probabilities in images, right? And there's reason to think that the same thing goes on in the brain. If you think about it, we learn 40,000 words fairly early in our lives, and each of those words must have some distinct, there must be a name for it in our brain, right? It has to be coded somewhere in our brain. And one of the things we know from psychology is that there's a inescapable word frequency effect. That is, no matter what you're doing, and if you're using words in your experiments, you have to worry about their relative frequency, because no matter what your task is, experiment shows that there will be an effect of the relative frequency of the words. And that the interesting thing about word frequencies is that they extend over many orders of magnitude, 3 or I think I'm no expert in this area, but I think something like 5 orders of magnitude. That is, there are words that you use 100 times a day, and there are words that you use that you know, but you only use or hear them once every 5 years. All right, so they cover a huge range, frequency range, and we know that the brain knows that frequency because the reaction times depend on those frequencies. Okay, so now let's look at how this plays out, right, in encoding the different distributions, in this case, the exponential and the normal, that Ben was just walking us through. So suppose we want to encode the different intervals that are exponentially distributed. Now we know from Weber's law that the brain's encoding of intervals is relatively crude, right? It's somewhere between plus or minus 10% and plus or minus 25% is the just noticeable difference. And so that implies that within any given range of intervals, the brain only distinguishes something like between 8 and 16 different intervals. There are, put another way, a more traditional way, there are only 8 or 16 just noticeable differences within a given range. So you can represent that by a histogram here that has 8 bins. This is the encoding for the exponential. And if we used a mindless population code, we would say we're going to use some number of spikes to encode each different JND, and that's represented, the number of the spike train is represented by the number of ones. And we'll just assign them to the different possibilities at random. All right, so we represent this interval with 3 spikes, and we represent this interval with 8 spikes. And we represent this interval out here with 7 spikes, and this one with 2 spikes, and so on, right? Just think of these as spike trains. Well, this is a wildly inefficient code. I mean, look, this interval we're going to represent, if we hear it 1,000 times, we're going to rep 600, 700, and almost 700 of those will just be this interval, right? And we're going to represent it every time with 3 spikes. Now you have to remember there's a cost. And in fact, astonishingly few people, computational neuroscientists, seem to know what the spike of the energetic cost of a spike is. And it's important because it's enormous. It costs, you have to hydrolyze 10 to the 8th, 10 raised to the power of 8 ATPs in order to transmit 1 spike in an unmyelinated neuron. That tells you that, boy, there's a huge cost to making your code inefficient. So presumably over evolutionary time, the brain has moved toward more efficient codes. Now, you could encode it using a binary scheme, which can be realized in any physical thing. You can realize it in spikes just by setting up 2 different inner spike intervals. One inner spike interval is for 0, and the other inner spike interval is for 1. And then you can assign these codes in a more sensible way, right? So we assign the inner spike, we would make the shortest possible inner spike interval designate the 0 in a binary scheme and let that represent these intervals here. And then we let the other interval, the 1 interval, represent these intervals here. Between them, we just have to send these one pair, right? And we're capturing most of the data that we're ever going to encode or represent, store in memory or transmit. And then for the things that happen much less often, we use the inner spike interval for 1 and followed by the inner spike interval for 0. And here we use the 1, that pair of inner spike intervals. And then out here, we get to 3 spikes and so on. So these take longer to transmit and they use much more energy because remember every spike costs 10 to the 8th ATPs, but we hardly ever send these anyway, so we've got a sensible code. And of course, the same thing applies if we're doing memory. So here's but we could do things even more efficiently because if the receiver can discriminate different inner spike intervals, then we can use a single pair of inner spike intervals. And now I've moved to the second plot. I'm not sure how obvious my cursor is, but now we use the shortest inner spike interval. Now look at the interval between the 2 ones. we use that to represent the very frequent, the intervals that we encounter very often, the inter-response intervals, for example, because they are approximately exponentially distributed. And then we use a longer spacing to represent the next, and a still longer, and the spacing here is growing as the log of the, as a surprisal, right? So the spaces between the ones here are proportional to the surprisal, as Shannon tells us they should be. So when we get out here, we have, it takes longer to transmit this very unusual datum, but we almost never transmit it. And then we're concentrating our code so that we can quickly transmit the things that occur most often, which of course makes all kinds of sense. Now, what if we come to encode a normal distribution, right? Well, we no longer want to put the 0 down here at the low end of things, right? Because you always want to put the most efficient code words where the most data are, right? And what I've shown here, which I'm not going to, would require a whole lecture to show you what I'm showing here, the variable length 2's complement binary encoding of this distribution, which is very efficient. Everything out here is negative, right? In 2's complement, if the code word starts with a 1, it's designating a negative quantity. And what we're encoding here is that the 0 is the reference point. There needs to be a separate thing that specifies where the 0 actually is. That is, there needs to be a scale factor. The same thing is true up here. I'm neglecting the scale factor up here, but in every case there would be a scale factor, but it's common to all of these code words, so it only has to be transmitted once. And the same thing is true here. We transmit the scale factor to tell us, in effect, where this distribution is actually located. And then each of the different intervals is represented by the extent to which it deviates from the location of the device. So here we subtract, we say, it's this far below the location. And here we say, if the code word starts with a 0, then it's above the location of the distribution. So these are examples of the application of Shannon's coding theorem. There are many people in the tech industry make their living by working out efficient codes. So I think that we should stop now for quick. Hang on, let me look at what my yeah, no, I think that's enough for one day. We've already run over our half hour. So let's have questions. I hope this coding stuff is transparent, but I have a nasty feeling that it's more or less incomprehensible. So I hope some courageous individuals who haven't followed this will try to ask a question that may enable me to make it clearer.
People think I can jump in while people think about their questions, perhaps get started. In the second graph, you somewhat dismiss basically quite quickly the enter-spike interval code to the benefit of the implicit distribution that you would have for the third graph. Can you perhaps comment a bit why you would think that the second graph would not be sufficient enough efficient?
Oh, it would be. It would. Yes, thank you, Virginie. No, the inner spike interval is in fact always the most efficient, and it can be adapted to any of these schemes. In my own mind, I had sort of made that clear, but I realized I really hadn't, because I pointed out in reference to this graph that one could instantiate the zeros and the ones by two different inner spike intervals, right? And the same applies down here. That is, I haven't shown pairs of inner spike intervals, but the down here as well, one could represent, instead, I've shown the binary, right? I've said, well, we're going to assign whatever interval. Remember, in constructing a code, a physically realized code, you have to take some physical resource and you have to assign it to an abstraction like 1 or 0, right? And so you could assign a nucleotide, you could assign an inner spike interval, you could assign a pattern of spikes, that would be called a population code. But at the end of the day, you have to face that step. You have to say, okay, what do we imagine the physical realization of these abstractions actually is, right? And so I've worked here at the abstraction level, right? But if we come to inner spike intervals, we would say, let's use this inner spike interval to represent 0. And this inner spike interval, which is just discriminably different from this. Now, when we say just discriminably different, what we mean is there must exist machinery at the molecular or the synaptic level that reacts differently depending upon whether it gets this inner spike interval or this inner spike interval. Now, for those people who want to see these ideas explored at great length in a serious neuroscience context, I cannot recommend too strongly the book by Rika et al. Rika, Van Stevenik, and Bialik. There are 4 authors called Spikes, Explorations of the Neural Code. And they investigate both theoretically and using extensive data from the large field motion detection neurons in the housefly. The question of what is the code that that neuron is using in order to transmit to the brain of that fly the movements of the visual field. And what they conclude is that it's using an inner spike interval code. And they even calculate how many bits it's transmitting per spike. And they conclude that it's transmitting something like 3 bits per spike, right? Which is the kind of efficiency that you get when you use an inner spike interval code. And the more intervals that the receiving end can discriminate, the more efficient the code becomes, because the number of discriminable intervals determines how many different messages can be transmitted by one pair of spikes. So to reiterate, just replace the 1 with one inner spike interval and the 0 with a different one, and then use those for the code, and that would be how you could do an efficient inner spike interval code. And I see that there's Peter Coyle has a.
Peter Coyle.
Yes, I'm wondering if you've thought about ratios, the ratio of one interval to another interval, and in terms of fractions. Like, I don't know, are you familiar with Fourier sequences? The Fourier sequence.
I don't think so.
Well, I'll email you some stuff that I've been working on with regards to the ratio of one interval to the another interval. That is pairing 1 and 2, interval 1 with interval 2.
Yes.
The ratio there.
Yes, actually, I should make it clear, which I certainly have not, that none of the codes that I'm showing here are actually maximally, well, this one actually is maximally efficient, I think, but in general, actually constructing the efficient codes is very dependent upon your source statistics. The Shannon's theorem tells us that it must be dependent. And there are, I think I mentioned that many people in the tech industry make their living by devising these efficient codes for different contexts. And there are other issues that arise aside just from the efficiency. One issue is, how readily can that code be used to do computations? And that's a separate issue, and that can come in conflict with the issue of how efficient it is. So it's a really interesting area for people to think about what codes the brain might actually be using. But in what's going to follow, we will never be actually constructing the codes. Right? We're going to, in this new approach, we're just going to estimate the parameters of the distribution using Bayesian parameter estimation and use those parameter estimates to say, well, this distribution differs from that distribution, right? This conditional distribution differs from the marginal distribution, and therefore there's information about the marginal variable in this conditional distribution. That's where we're headed. And we will draw all kinds of conclusions and use it all kinds of ways, just relying on the parameter estimates without ever actually constructing the different codes. But in the back of our mind, one should always be saying, well, yeah, and the fact that these things differ means that the brain may be recoding these data for two reasons. One, the model that enables the efficient code enables you to economize on memory storage, which presumably is important. And secondly, the more efficient the code, the better that model is, the better it captures the source statistics. Again, we get that directly from Shannon's coding theorem. And therefore, the better that model will predict what's going to happen. That is, the better the model that encodes the data you already have, once you control for model complexity, the better it predicts the data you haven't yet seen. That is, it predicts the future. And of course, these days, everybody's clued into the fact that the brain is very interested in predicting, and that predictions naturally involve time. That's what this audience is all about, the people who are studying that.
Thank you.
Any other questions crop up, Virgin?
I have one question. What do you think? What do you think the implementational cost of the precision that you need to be able to code information by interspike intervals? So clearly, you need some precision by which you need to code information such that it becomes informative for it to be able to distinguish different entities or different quantities, whatever. What is the implementational cost of that precision? And is that less than the cost of coding things according to the very top figure?
Well, that's exactly the right question. I've clearly got through to you in the sense that that's the right question to ask. Now, if you expect me to answer that question, well, no, that's a clearly an empirical question, right? However, if you read the Rika et al. Book, you get some clue to that, because whereas in the fly case, they conclude that the system is transmitting about 3 bits per spike. you can invert that calculation to estimate sort of how precisely the receiving end must be reading the interspike intervals, right? Don't ask me to do that right now off the top of my head, but because the number of bits is telling you how many different right? If it's 3 bits means that it's discriminating 8 different interspike intervals, basically, right? And they also show, by the way, that that same system is transmitting the scale factor as well. So remember, I said that here we're just encoding the different intervals within some range, within some scale, right? And the exact same thing is true for that large field motion detector in the fly. This is a yaw detecting system, basically, right? So when the fly is flying in calm weather, it's not yawing very much at all. And so it adjusts again the scale of the system to detect small yaws. You've been sailing with me, Fuad, so you know what yawing's all about, right? But when it's flying in very gusty weather, it's experiencing very big yaws and it has to rescale things, right? But at each different scale, it can detect about 8 different things. Now, Rika went on to do the same thing in the human, in other visual systems. And in some of the systems that he worked on, you get up to 7 bits per spike, all right? So now you're discriminating 2 to the 7th different interspike intervals, right? Now, as your question points out, Fuad, look, that implies a pretty impressive machinery at the synaptic end, the receiving end of these spike trains, right? And presumably, I mean, cost comes in everywhere, right? Presumably, there's some cost to building machinery that's good enough to discriminate 2 to the 7th different interspike intervals. And I think at this stage, no one knows what that machinery is. And we really can't find a way to estimate the cost. If you, as you may know, or people may not know, in the auditory system, auditory localization is based on the discrimination of different arrival times at the spikes at the synapses. And the BAT discriminates different, the BAT auditory system discriminates difference in arrival times at a sub-microsecond level, right? It's working down at the nanosecond level, which is mind-boggling when you consider that the spikes themselves are several hundred microseconds long, right? But the auditory system can discriminate incredibly fine differences in arrival time. But these other systems don't seem to do nearly as good discriminations, which suggests that, yeah, there must be some non-trivial cost, right? That in the auditory case, the cost of not making that discrimination is sufficiently high that some very fancy machinery is being deployed. Again, as far as I know, no one knows how it is those synapses are able to make such incredibly fine scale discriminations in differences in arrival time. I'm sure there are people working on it. It's basically a biophysical problem, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
We've got a little bit of time here. If there are no questions, I'm tempted to go on to the next. Yeah.
I could have some more questions if no
Go
one.
ahead.
I have so many questions actually. I'm surprised people don't dare. Maybe I don't know. Just to jump on the explanation that you, or the example that you just gave. So it's a sort of an orthogonal and more of a comment sort of question, but maybe you can bring up. in your example of sound localization, for instance, in this case, we're talking about timing. So timing of information, which phenomenologically for the animal comes to be a spatial localization, right? So
Yes.
in the abstraction there, that's accessible to consciousness, to use lots of jargon, but just to try and situate, is that the information that's being represented for the animal is indeed a spatial location. So, but then you use a timing code for this. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is the timing code that you propose here, is it selective or specific to the representation of time? Or is it a generic temporal coding scheme that you see applicable to, any information basically? And I think you.
Virginie, what would I do without you? So a timing-based scheme is in principle applicable to anything at all that you want to code. That's, let me go back here. That's the importance of being able to move your thinking from this level, from the bits level, from the 1 and 0, right? I think we all understand that a binary code is used in computers, and that means that that binary code encodes everything that a computer encodes. And that means that it encodes everything that we know how to encode, period, right? That is, there's nothing that we know how to encode that we can't put into a computer. That's one of the sort of obvious lessons of the technological revolution that I've lived through in my lifetime. Okay, so using 1s and 0s, you can encode anything, right? When you take a picture on your camera, it's all 1s and 0s, right? When you do a spreadsheet, it's all 1s and 0s. When you write text, it's all 1s and 0s, right? The ASCII code tells us what the 1 and 0 patterns are that stand for the different keys on the keyboard, right? So my fascination with computer science has always been in making the translation from that level of abstraction, the abstract specification of the code, to the actual physical realization of the code. And the kind of general answer to your question is that there's an almost total disconnect. That is that in principle, there's an infinite number of different physical realizations that one can use to get a physically realized computing machine. That said, then suddenly the engineers come in. They say, well, yeah, in principle maybe, but in practice, some physical realizations are incomparably better than others, right? I used to use in class a wooden implementation of a binary adding thing, which was dropping balls in something, right? And it was lovely to illustrate the basic principle, right? But no engineer in their right mind would think, oh, we're going to build a computer out of that system, right? It's too noisy, too slow, too bulky, too everything, right? So when it comes to the engineering, that's why I deliberately talked about the different, inner spike intervals, or just throwing spikes at it, or using something like a 2's complement scheme, and so on, to try to sensitize people to the fact that first you want to kind of think it out at the abstract level, and then you say, okay, what are we going to physically realize this with? Now, what do I think myself? Well, I think that in memory, it's actually done at the molecular level with nucleotides, right? Which are it's trivial to do this with nucleotides. There are only 4 nucleotides that RNA is built out of, and so you say, okay, we'll use 2 of them for the ones and zeros, and we'll use maybe the other 2 to do the exponents. And okay, we'll say I always thymine. I always forget the names, particularly when I'm talking. When I'm just lying there, I can think of them. But anyway, the C, you'll say, okay, let C be 1, and we'll let A be the others. Okay, so now we can start building strings of ones and zeros, and we can imagine that that's how the brain is ultimately encoding these things. Of course, at the moment, we just don't know, but in order that we ever know, there have to be people who are thinking about the question that you asked and that I'm stammering trying to answer, namely, how do you get from the abstraction of an efficient code to the physical realization of that abstraction? And that's where the engineering comes in. That's where you have to ask, well, how much does it cost, right? How many ATPs do you have to hydrolyze? While I'm at it, since I'm grinding this axe, I just pointed out that to send 1 spike, you have to hydrolyze 10 to the 8th, right? You might ask, how much does it cost to add 1 nucleotide to a string of nucleotides? And the answer is 1 ATP. So there's 10 to the 8th difference in the cost between encoding it in spikes and encoding it in nucleotides. That 10 to the 8th is a pretty big number. And these days, a lot of people are impressed at how few watts the brain consumes, right? I mean, my brain, if I recall, we're consuming something like 27 watts, right? Whereas my laptop is burning a lot more energy than that. And yet my brain for many things is still better than my laptop. So not for everything, but for many things. So it's an important question, right? What the physics, and there you have to bring in the engineering. You have to start taking the costs seriously. And to repeat, there are 2 aspects of the engineering. What's efficient storage and transmission, but also what's efficient computationally, right? Because at the end of the day, one is going to have to take these representations and start doing arithmetic with them, right? Adding them, subtracting them, multiplying them, and so on. And there a whole new game comes in. There's one of Cover and Thomas is the Bible of information theory, a textbook. And my favorite quote, I think, occurs in the first page or 2, in which they say that communication is computation limited and computation is communication limited, right? That when it comes to computation and communication, they're fused at the hip. You have to always be considering both. Well, I think that.
Is there any other question from the audience? We were talking also for the young crowd or any crowd really. Don't hesitate to send an email to Randy. We were chatting about this at the onset. If you need time to integrate information.
Yeah, don't be bashful about sending email questions. I will probably use them as a springboard in the subsequent lectures. But also don't be bashful about asking for code from either Ben or me. All these graphs and so on are, of course, generated by code, and I've got tons of code. I spend my days writing MATLAB code, and I'm all of the stuff that I'll be talking. We'll now be heading into actually. This lecture sort of concludes the background science, so to speak, the information theory, the base, the mathematics. And now we'll be showing how you can use this to analyze your timing research data and associative learning data, and also how to understand it. I think these tools cast associative learning in a new and very interesting light, and give it a firmer mathematical foundation. So that's where we're headed in the subsequent lectures.
On June 1st. The next lecture will be June.
Yeah, June 1st, right. Okay. Welcome to
Thank you.
spring, everybody.